There's a handful of companies that have been getting recognition and press on what's going on in terms of the changing nature of performance management right now. And certainly Deloitte has maybe gotten more than its share of the conversation, particularly those of you who might have seen the Harvard Business Review article on what they've done. Well, it's catch-up time, in part, in terms of, that was a year and a half ago. And while they were rolling out the program, and the questions that were being asked, questions that were being answered, and year and a half forward, here we are tonight. So, Erica, thanks so much for coming. Oh, I think it starts from the bottom. Here.
How's that? Oh, that's good.
Okay. Works. So, just to start tonight, quick question for the audience. How many of you are currently working on a new performance management system for your companies or for a client, thinking about putting in a new performance management system for your company or your clients, or have actually installed one before? I'll raise my hand on those too. Good. What, maybe 30, 40% of the group? So I kind of want to walk through the process with you tonight, Erica, in terms of where it all started and where you are now, which I think is a fascinating story in its own right. So let's begin with the discovery process. What precipitated Deloitte to suddenly change from a time immemorial process to the dramatic changes you guys have been making?
Yeah, it is a fascinating story, I think, as well. Because really, we never had a meeting where we said, we should do something different about performance management. That isn't really where we started. This work started back in 2011 when we opened the doors to what we call Deloitte University. Deloitte University, for those who haven't seen pictures or read articles or even been there, is about a 100-acre facility that we have in Westlake, Texas. And it is it's really a corporate training facility, but that doesn't really do it justice. We refer to it as the Leadership Center. And the idea is that it is this physical culture-building place where our people come and leave having been educated on something and having been really infused with the culture of Deloitte. And that really is the home of where we develop our leaders. When we talk about leaders, we really mean anyone at Deloitte who leads someone else. So you could be a year and a half out of college and leading someone who's 6 months out of college, right? Really anyone who has people reporting into them in either a formal way or even an informal way, we consider that a leader. And so we really want to start growing those people from the minute they walk in the door. So as you can imagine, it was 2011. It was a time when organizations were moving away from bricks and mortar kinds of investments in training and moving towards e-learning. And the partners of Deloitte made this crazy decision to reach into their pockets and fund the building of this place. They did. They built it. It's phenomenal. They then turned to the talent development organization and basically said, don't screw this up, right? They said, we built you this home. Go fill it. Go fill it with something amazing. And so that really was the impetus for us inside of talent development to develop our next level strategy, to think about how is it that we want to use this place? How is it that we want to oversee the way we do or overhaul the way we do development inside of Deloitte? So we did a lot of research, as one is wont to do at the beginning of a new strategy stage. And that's really where we came upon this notion of strengths-based development. How many folks have done reading or familiar with this concept around strengths? Okay, about half the room, right? This concept that we each have the greatest opportunity to grow the most in the areas where we are already strong. And there's all of this data around high performance and high-performing teams and development and growth, and all of it kind of kept pointing back to strengths externally. So we replicated the research internally inside of Deloitte. We looked at our high-performing teams at Deloitte, and sure enough, this whole thing around strengths bore out. So it was sort of like this secret sauce moment for us. We had discovered this holy grail of what is it we should be driving towards. And so once we came upon this research, we took a look then at all of our HR processes. And we said, okay, so what is it that we're doing inside of Deloitte to help deliver on this notion of strengths? And is there anything that we're doing that is potentially getting in the way of that? And good news is, of course, there were a lot of things that we could point to that we were already doing well. There were areas of improvement identified. But really the biggest aha that we had was, we believe strengths is how to grow our people. And we have this performance management process that is basically built around remediation. Right? Let's review our people. Let's figure out what's wrong with them, and then let's go fix it, right? And that process that we had at Deloitte was working fine. It kind of produced the outcomes we needed it to produce. It helped us figure out how to pay people and who to promote and who to recommend for a high performer program, who to separate as needed, et cetera. So it's kind of producing what we needed it to. But we had this moment of, gosh, this seems like it's not fitting. And so that really was the beginning of us then looking into, gosh, what would strengths-based performance management look like?
So in that context, you found you had an opportunity, but what you had was working. Mm-hmm. So how did you sell the idea of change?
So at Deloitte, anyone who knows Deloitte or anyone who's worked with a professional services firm, maybe not a PC thing to say, but probably an appropriate thing to say that we are in the hours business, right? We make our money by hours. So we thought if we are going to size this problem and figure out whether or not it's something that is really worth investing in, worth doing something different, right, upsetting the apple cart, let's figure out how much time are we spending on this performance management thing. And we did this study of, simple time and motion study. And what we found, and at the time we were a little shy of 70,000 people inside the U.S., and what we found at the time was we spend 1.8 million hours a year on performance management. 1.8 million hours. And remember, we're a business where an hour actually has a price tag associated with it, right? So we could actually calculate what that was costing our business. So our leaders are mature leaders, they're forward thinking, and they said, well, of course we spend 2 million hours a year on our people. Our people are our product, right? We are proud of the fact that we're spending 1.8 million hours a year. Let's just make sure we're spending it on the right things. So we took a look at some of the data that we had available to us, one of which was a survey, one piece of which is a survey that we do every year. I'm sure lots of organizations have their annual talent survey, annual employee engagement survey. There's a question in that survey that said, someone at Deloitte takes a meaningful interest in my career. And 68% of our people had a neutral or negative answer to that question. And so when you look at that data alongside this investment of 1.8 million hours, we thought, gosh, maybe we're not spending that time on the right stuff. So we took a look at what is it that makes up those 1.8 million hours, and what we found was that the majority of that time was spent filling out forms, prepping for calibration sessions, or inside of calibration sessions, these closed-door sessions where we're talking about our people. And we had this aha moment of we are spending all of that time not talking to the people whose performance we are supposed to be inspiring here. And that really was that, oh my goodness, we have a problem kind of moment, where we realized that doing performance differently didn't necessarily mean spending less time on it, but how do we make sure that we're spending time on the right things, on things that are actually going to drive performance?
As an alum of Price Waterhouse back in my early career, that conclave that took place in March, going over everybody from the lowest first-year accountant to the senior manager up for partner, that conclave and the secret discussions that went on behind those doors, that, by the way, were never shared. Never shared. Somebody would be promoted quickly, somebody would be held back. Somebody would be told they're not performing and be asked to leave. But what went on behind those closed doors, as it was in, so far as I know, Deloitte's not alone, Pricewaterhouse's not alone, E&Y is still like that. I mean, and other accounting firms, I mean, in consulting firms, nothing new. So with what you discovered, as I recall from the HBR article, you struggled with the question, so what is performance management for? Mm-hmm. And you found?
So we just, if we were going to go back to basics, we had to figure out, well, okay, we know we need to do something different around performance management, like any good team of consultants, and fortunately we have access to some good consultants. We worked through a process to say, if we want to revamp performance management, we need to start at the beginning to think, what really is the purpose of this process? So to answer that question, we asked our people. We went out and we did focus groups at every level in the organization. We spent about 3 months doing focus groups, from our most junior analysts all the way up through our partners. And we, from everything that we learned through those focus groups, what we found was that there were really 3 primary things that our people believed performance management should be for, right? What was the purpose of performance management? The first thing we heard was it should enable us as an organization to recognize performance, right? How do we figure out who to pay, who to run through a low performer process, right? Who to separate, et cetera. And as I said before, our old process did that. And I think most performance management processes do that just fine. A second thing that we heard was it should really enable us to see performance, by which there should be data available to each leader that they can take a look at it and see what performance looks like in our organization. Now, arguably, we had that in the past, but miraculously, performance looked exactly the same in every single organization, right? It looked like a bell curve. So it wasn't necessarily an accurate representation of what performance truly looked like in that organization or on that team. It was just really the representation of the application of an HR policy, right? We made performance look like a bell curve because those were the buckets that we had to slot people into. So what if an actual leader could take a look throughout the year at some tool that said, this is what my organization looks like right now, and then 6 months later, now it looks like this, and who are these people up here, and who are those people down there? So this notion of seeing performance. And by the way, because we're a business that goes to market in teams, we didn't just want to be able to isolate data on individual performance, but we want to be able to see team performance, right? Who are our highest performing teams? What is it that they're doing differently? Do we want to make outsized investments in those folks? And then the third thing that we heard, and this one it kind of makes me giggle when I think about it, is performance management should fuel performance, right? It should create more performance. And that seems really obvious, right? The purpose of managing performance is to get more of it. But when we took a look at what we had been doing, and we asked ourselves, okay, well, what about this process is really enabling us to fuel performance every day in the work, on the client engagements, where people are doing their work inside their teams every day? We didn't really have a good answer because the work was happening over here every day and the process was happening over here like twice a year, right? So that was this big aha moment for us to say, all right, we got to turn this thing around. If we're going to reinvest those 1.8 million hours, we need to put more focus on the fueling part and spend as less time as possible on the recognizing part. And we thought that to do that, there had to be, just based on research we had done and what we had heard from our own people, that there should be a balance of conversations and data. So we set out to build a process that enabled us to fuel, see, and recognize performance through conversations and data.
So I'm going to go back to some things that I had that I might have filled in here, but the end result was that you came up with, which is, to me, a misnomer, what's called a simple plan. Because it
didn't feel simple.
This wasn't simple. But there were, 5 criteria that kind of fell in under that umbrella of the simple plan, so to speak. The criteria, concentration on the rater, testing, frequency, et cetera. But I think one of the most interesting aspects of one of the things they discovered in the research, which I frankly sort of knew but never really thought about it exactly the way they did, which is the rater, him or herself. Talk about what you all found about that.
Yeah, so you'll notice that up to this point, I have not said we wanted to get rid of performance management, we wanted to eliminate performance reviews, we wanted to get rid of ratings, right? That was kind of never on that wasn't on our list of objectives, right? Really what we were trying to set out to do was all those things I just described. But as we dug into the process and into the research, one of the things that struck us was this notion of rater bias. And there's really cool data out there that talks about how that we are actually really unreliable raters of other people. That the single biggest driver of what I am going to rate you has more to do with me than it does to do with you, right? This notion of the idiosyncratic rater effect. And so we knew that we needed data on which to make talent decisions. There are lots of organizations out there who are trying to get rid of performance management, who are trying to eliminate performance appraisals. You were just sharing with me, right, a story about clients who have that got rid of appraisals altogether. That may be the right answer for certain organizations. We knew it wouldn't be the right answer for Deloitte, and I can talk about that in a moment. But we did have this problem of we really want this to be reliable data, and ratings, this notion of summative year-end ratings, tend to be unreliable because they're more about me rating my experiences than me rating you. So we wanted to look at a way that we could still gather performance data on our people, but do it in a little bit more of a reliable way.
Okay. Let's talk about the reliable way, the 4 questions.
Sure. So people always go there first, and it's not my favorite part of the design, but I'll entertain the question as long as you let me talk about check-ins next, okay? Anyone who read the HBR piece saw that was what the focus of the HBR piece was, and when that came out, I was like, man, it's kind of cool to be published in HBR, and at the same time, they didn't really focus on my favorite part. So we have this situation at Deloitte, as many professional services firms do, that people have lots of bosses throughout the year, right? I'm a member of a practice. There's 400 people in my practice. It's a national practice. I get staffed on this client project for 3 months. I get staffed over there for 6 weeks. I get staffed over here for 4 months, right? So at the end of the year, I've had lots of different performance experiences, and I've had those experiences with lots of different team leaders, right? Lots of different bosses. So unlike in a traditional corporate organization where you've got a boss, and that's your boss the whole year, right? They're the person who's closest to your performance. They're the person who sees you do your work every day. They're probably also the person that either makes or weighs in on the decision about whether or not you get promoted and paid. We didn't have that, right? So we needed a way to gather data from over here where all the work was happening and pull it in over here where all the decisions were being made. I think it's somewhat unique to a professional services firm, so this certainly isn't a necessarily one-size-fits-all approach. But for us, we knew that we needed to solve for that problem. So what we implemented is something that we call a performance snapshot. It was named that because that's exactly what it is, right? It's a snapshot of a moment in time, kind of a capture of a moment in time. And in that snapshot, we ask the manager to answer 4 questions. I'll tell you what those are in a moment. The idea of this thing is that you can do it at the cadence that makes sense for you. So in our tax business, where people are constantly doing like little short-term projects, some of our tax professionals could have like 40 snapshots at the end of the year. In our consulting business, where work tends to be longer term, maybe I'm on a large IT implementation and it's 3 years long, and I'm on the same project for the whole year, our recommendation is that everyone needs to have a minimum of 4, right? And we found that through testing this design, you really need kind of the 4 data points in order to see any sort of distribution of data, right? If you want to see performance in a natural way, you needed that volume in order to have enough data to represent what's going on throughout the year. So the people in Deloitte who have the fewest of them have 4. The people in Deloitte who have the most of them have like 42, I think is the record number. And the average Deloitte person has anywhere from like 7 to 12. And the idea is that depending on your business, you fill it out at the cadence that makes sense for you. You fill it out as you roll off a project, as a particular project phase ends. And they get weighted by the number of hours. So if you work on a project for 3 months, it's weighted more heavily than a project for 6 months, right? Pretty simple stuff. I, as the employee, I, as the team member, trigger it. So it's on me to say, hey, John, I just completed a job for you. Remember, here's my name. Here's that project charge code. Here are the number of hours I worked on it for you now. You go fill it out, right? So I've kind of got a role in the process. And then John fills it out and sends it in. Four questions, no open text boxes, right? So it's just radio buttons. First question is, and I'm not going to get the wording 100% right because we've redone it so many times, but the question is something like, if, based on what I've seen of John's performance, and if it were my money, I would always award John the highest possible compensation. Right? Now, what you'll see in that question is a couple things. One is, it's a question about me. Right? I would always award John the highest possible compensation. I'm not a very good reliable rater of John, but I'm a really reliable rater on what I am most likely to do. Right?
That's why I asked her to come, by the way.
So the questions are always me rating me, right? Me rating my tendencies. The second thing you hear inside that question is an extreme, right? I would always pay John the highest possible compensation, right? Think about the people who work for you. There are probably people on your team who you really like, who you think are really good. And if you were asked the question, is John any good? You'd say, yeah, sure. Right? But would you always award John the well, maybe not the highest possible, just kind of somewhere towards the top, right? So if you want to generate a distribution in the data, if you really want to be able to differentiate performance, having that extreme wording in there, just from a survey question design standpoint, has really created the type of differentiation that we're looking for. So that's the first question. That first question is really about value, right? What value is John creating? And of course, in our training, we had all those managers who were like, well, I don't really know what his base is, or where he is in his range. Like, no, that's not what we're talking about, right? We're not talking about compensation here, right? What we're talking about is, if you had $100 to spend, how much of it would you want to spend on John based on the value that he's creating? Second question is, I would always want John on my team. And that's a really important question for us because, again, getting staffed is where it's at for Deloitte, right? We go to market in teams. We actually have some people who are really talented at what they do and who nobody wants to work with, right? We need to be able to find those people. And so this notion of kind of teaminess is the second thing that we need next to value. And those two questions can be plotted on, the responses to those two questions. There's a 5-point from strongly agree to strongly disagree, or the way around, actually. And we can plot those results on a scatter plot, question 1 on one axis, question 2 on the other axis, and you can start to see what performance looks like in your organization. And it's kind of clustered up towards the top, right? But you can draw lines anywhere and figure out, here's where each of these people fall. So that is how we evaluate kind of overall performance on the job, on the local job. There's 2 other questions in the snapshot, though. One says, John is at risk for low performance. Right? Yes or no? Notice that word at risk is there, right? It doesn't say John is a low performer. And the idea of this question is that it's not supposed to be an evaluation of John. We don't take it into account what we're paying him. The purpose of that question is to find John if he's struggling. Right? In our old model, we had a mid-year process and a year-end process. We had a 5-point rating scale with 5 being the lowest. So people would be rated a 4 or a 5 after they'd consistently been performing at 4 or 5 level for 6 months. That was the first time we found them. And then we thought, gosh, we've got this 4 or 5 list, but they're almost too far to save, right? How do we find people when they're trending downwards? How do we collect that data throughout the year so that we can find you as you're at risk and remediate the performance, right? Because, yeah, sure, we're a strengths-based organization, but we've got to get people the life preservers that they need when they need them. So there's that yes-no question, generates a flag in the system. Once a month, our HR people go and run a report and say, show me all of the people who were newly added to that list. Pick up the phone, make a phone call, and find out what's going on there. Fourth question is, John is performing at the next level. And the idea of that is, again, it's a yes-no. And the idea of that one is it helps us generate our list of who should be promoted. Now, again, that's not a guarantee, right? Getting one person to say yes is not a guarantee, but it helps us cull the 80,000 people of Deloitte down to a list, practice by practice, of who should we even be looking at the end of the year. Who's the list that we start with to start to look at promotion? So first two questions are about kind of capturing overall performance on the local job. And then the second two questions are really just generating flags for the purposes of managing other HR processes.
So your favorite part?
My favorite part. Okay. So my favorite part is check-ins. And the reason check-ins is my favorite part is because it's so simple, right? You used the word simple before. We had this unbelievable innovation at Deloitte, the most innovative thing we've come up with in talent in a long time, and that is talk to your people. Right? And it sounds crazy that that's an innovation, but it really is, right? We have all this super cool data that shows the correlation between one-on-one conversations and performance results, one-on-one conversations, conversation frequency, and employee engagement. And so we've been able to isolate check-ins, which is what we refer to as a frequent, future-focused conversation about the work, right? That's how we define a check-in. That is the single greatest driver of performance at Deloitte. And so we have been able to go out there and say, okay, this snapshot thing, that helps us with recognize, and that helps us with see. But if we want to really get the fuel thing right, if we really want to create more performance every day in the work where it's happening, we need to create a discipline. We need to create a habit of our team leaders talking regularly with intentionality, not just like, hey, how was your weekend, right? To their people about the work. And the big unlock for us, again, we're in the hours business, right? So imagine going out to all these people who bill a lot of money an hour and saying, you need to stop doing your work once a week and go talk to your people. And then when you're done with that, you can resume doing your work and billing your clients again, right? That idea was not going to fly. The notion of going out there and saying, you need to have an HR conversation, right? You need to have a counseling conversation. No, that's not what this is. This is a conversation about the work, right? How else do you get work done if not by talking to your people? How else do you identify risk? How else do you, identify opportunities to provide feedback? How else do you tell people what they're doing right? If not through conversation. And so by giving it a name, giving it a definition, and starting to collect some data around the frequency of it, we've been able to create this discipline of check-ins. Now, other organizations that have moved in the direction of something different inside of performance management, they also use this concept of a check-in. I think, I'm going to get the frequency wrong, but I think Adobe, who first started talking about this, they do them quarterly. I know there are other organizations who do them monthly. And from our perspective, if you don't do them often enough, they aren't really about the work, right? If I were to ask you, think about what it is you want to accomplish this year, right? You're going to give me some, vague, I'm sure you have them written down somewhere, right? Some really vague aspirations about what it is you want to accomplish this year. If I were to say to you, what do you want to accomplish in the next week? You're going to have a pretty tactical list of things to think about. And so we want the level of conversation between team leader and team member to be at that tactical level. And that's really where we see, the feedback just becomes much more natural. Right? It's not this, I've got something I need to share with you. I'm going to think back on the last 6 months and tell you how you've been doing, and I kind of have a knot in my stomach, and you kind of do too, right? It's this very formal feedback conversation, as opposed to, hey, we talked last week about what was going on this week. Now we're going to talk now about what's going on next week, and feedback just becomes natural in the course of that conversation. So for us, putting a discipline around check-ins has had the single greatest impact on our organization.
So, those of you who have developed a performance management system or been involved in seeing one roll out, from my point of view, the fear and the make or break is on the manager who has to do the check-ins. And so when I've put in a system, the first point of contact, I've got to train the managers in this transformation of their job. But Deloitte took a different route, and I love this.
Yeah, so I was speaking with another organization about a year ago out on the West Coast, and they did something similar. And, we were kind of just sharing stories, and I said to them, tell me about your process. And what they said was, well, one of our criteria before we would flip the switch on the new process was where 80% of our people leaders go through conversation training. We had a 2-day course. We called it conversation, communicating with excellence or something like that. And we wanted 80% of our people leaders to go through this course. And then once they did, we were ready to flip the switch. How about you guys, right? And what I said is, we didn't train anybody. She looked at me with horror. And it's true. We decided that this notion of prospective training wasn't going to work in this situation, right? We do lots of training, of course. We built an enormous facility to do training, right? Obviously, we very much believe in it. We believe in classroom training. But for something like this, that was really about a cultural shift, that was really about art more than it was about science, we felt like people had to struggle with it a little bit, right? How many people in the room have an iPhone? How many people have ever gone to the site where you need to read the book like cover to cover to figure out how to use it? Right. You just kind of took it out and you figured it out. And maybe every now and then you Google a question that you have because you can't figure out how to do what you want to do, but you have to take it out, you got to play with it, you got to struggle with it. What we decided was, let's put this thing out there. In year 1, let's just help people figure out what they need to do. Here is what a check-in is and what my responsibility is inside of it. Here's what a snapshot is and how I fill one out. Here's what, we've got other elements of the design as well. Here's how comp works. Just train them on the how, that's it. Let them struggle with it a little bit. Let people sit through some awkward check-ins that don't go so well, right? You're having one every week. It's okay if some of them aren't perfect, right? And let's just do some habit formation. Let's do some habit creation. Get people used to doing this stuff. Then, after they've had the experience with it, they've struggled with it a little bit, then we can go out there and train them on what great looks like. Right? They've got that context to apply. And the best analogy, I know I shared this with you, I don't know if it's a great analogy, but I always think about the people who go for your MBA straight from undergrad, right? Those really driven people who say, I'm going to go straight, right? And you sit and you read those, Harvard cases, and you think you're really smart, and you come in prepared for class, and you're about to say something until the person sitting next to you, who just has 5 years work experience, raises his hand, right? And says something completely different based on his own work experience, and you think, gosh, I don't know anything, I'm going to keep my mouth shut, right? And to me, that's what this is, right? This notion of giving people experience to live inside the model a little bit and struggle with it a little bit before they can really have the context within which to learn about how to do it well. So we are now in the midst of this phase that I would call the optimization phase, right? If the first phase was about the implementation phase, how do we just get the thing out there? We're now in this optimization phase of how do we really help people start to do it better, to have the skills to have those conversations. And there are times that people ask us, like, did you forget to train us, right? Like, how did you think that we would do this on our own? But what we found was that enough of our people were good enough that putting it out there wasn't dangerous. And now we've got this real organizational groundswell to say, show me what great looks like, right? I want to be better, which really is kind of a learning person's dream.
Very brave. So Erica, obviously, a lot of what those of us who may or may not know about Deloitte have picked up a lot of it in older articles as you guys are early on and building it out and piloting it. So where is it now? Where are you in terms of, I think you told me on the phone that you're rolling it out to the last group now. Mm-hmm. And what have you learned? What's changed? What have you had to tweak or radically tweak?
Yeah. So at the time we published the article, we had basically just tested this thing, and that was kind of an interesting change management thing that we did at Deloitte. We are a private partnership, right? We don't have the luxury, and I think it is a luxury, of this notion of kind of corporate mandate, right? That's not Deloitte. Everyone's an owner, right? Because everyone actually is an owner, and so everyone has to agree that this is a good idea. And so when we came upon this design, we kind of finished the design phase. We didn't go to our leadership and say, can we do this, right? Let's vote on whether we think this is a good idea. All we really asked for permission on was can we test this? Our first test was 600 people, then 2,000 people, then 7,000 people, then 40,000 people, and we now, as of June of this year, are live in the entire organization, 80,000 people inside the U.S. And I will admit, on camera, on the record, that I thought that was a terrible idea, right? My perspective was you never have a second chance to make a first impression, right? We've got to get this thing perfect and clean and beautiful, or else our people are going to reject it. But our leadership felt like we've got to test this thing. We've got to believe that it works, right? It's cool that other organizations did this, but all the other organizations that have moved in this direction, those were product companies, right? They could kind of afford to mess it up because they weren't selling their people to the market. They were selling products to the market. We're selling our people to the market. We can't afford to mess this up. So we've got to test it ourselves and see how it works inside. And so we went out with a really quick and dirty and unsexy technology and started testing it. And what we found was people were coming to us and saying, could I get into the pilot? Could I get another 1,000 people into the pilot? And it was this kind of unintended consequence of creating this scarcity of people inside the model that we had businesses opting in. The other thing was that no business felt like this was being done to them, right? It's not HR's making me do this. But businesses could join at the pace at which they felt comfortable. Some businesses joined with a few people first and then said, I want everybody in. So we've just had our final business as of June 6th of this year. Our final business just jumped in. And so we're now live across the U.S. What that meant was that we lived with multiple models at once. It's really messy, but that stage is behind us. And we're now working on expanding globally as well. What have we learned along the way? The cool thing about a test is that there's no promise of getting it right? So we went out there with this notion of, hey, this is an experiment. Tell us how we do, and we're going to change it along the way. And at the time, I had thought there would be a point at which we would stop, right? The pilot's over now. The thing's baked, and now we're done. And what I've learned over the last 3.5 years or so is that I think that notion of experimentation won't ever end, right? We're going to keep listening to our people, looking at the data, keep seeing the results, and tweaking it along the way. Which I guess is some job security for me, but there really is sort of there's never finished. You asked what are some of the biggest things we learned. The first was around transparency. Someone over here said when we were talking about the old process, someone said, "Gosh, that sounds not particularly transparent." The perception though was that it was, right? Because when you came out of that room, I said, "Great news, you're a 2." Now I know everything I need to know about me. I'm a 2, right? And yeah, there wasn't a ton of transparency around what went into that. But at least I sort of knew where I stood, right? In this world where performance snapshots are being collected throughout the year, I don't see the results, by the way, right? The results go into the firm, so there's not a moment at which you sit down with me and say, here's what I scored you on question 1, and here's what I scored you on question 2. This feels really not transparent. Now, the reason we made that choice around not sharing snapshot results with people is because what we found was that when you don't apply a curve, if you know that you're going to have to share the results with people, you're likely to inflate them. People at Deloitte are really nice, right? They're really nice, and they don't want to upset you, especially if they know that you need to keep staying motivated to work for them. And so what we found was that when we put stuff out there without a forced curve, people were likely to inflate the scores. So we needed to figure out a way to get really honest captures of data without inflating the scores. So we made this decision to say, okay, we're not going to share snapshot results, but if you are having check-ins every week, you should be kind of sharing the essence of your perspective that you're putting in the snapshot inside of those check-ins. And originally we thought that was good enough. What we learned after a series of pilots was our people were left unsatisfied, right? At the end of the year, we sat down and said, okay, here's what your increase was this year, and here's what your bonus was this year. And they said, but why? And I could say, well, here are all the things that I know about what you did. And okay, but how do I fall relative to my peers? And what our managers were really good at was talking about what you did. What our managers were less good at was talking about you relative to your peers. So an addition that we made to the process that's now part of our process is you see what's called your performance dashboard at the end of the year. So what you don't see is the results to those 42 snapshots question by question, but what you do see is your dot, so to speak, right? So there's this notion of that scatter plot with question 1 and question 2 plotted next to each other. You can see this scatter plot and this little dot on it, and you can have this conversation to say, okay, this is you on this scatter plot. And this is where you fall relative to your peers on this particular measure. Now let's talk a little bit about that, right? How does that map back to what you've been hearing in your check-ins? Right? If your check-ins were leading you to believe your dot should have been somewhere else, you need to start asking different questions in your check-ins, right? So that was part of the performance dashboard, but that's not the only thing in there. So we have the scatter plot in there. We also have what we call our metrics, right? Our people are still held to performance metrics. They're things you would expect them to be, like billable hours and revenue and sales and those kinds of things. Performance metrics have not gone away, so you can, that's a really countable thing, and you can see your performance snapshot scores here, you can see your performance metrics over here, and then we have this third category that's something we call firm contributions. It's basically extracurricular activities. It's those things you're doing to invest in and build the practice. And we have data on that as well. So as opposed to in the old model where someone said you're a 2, or in the early version of this test where someone didn't really have any way to explain kind of how where you fell relative to your peers, now you've got this data source with 3 data elements on it, right? The performance snapshot relative to your peers, how you performed on local work, your metrics, and your firm contributions. And that is a springboard for an amazing conversation with someone called your career coach. So each of our people has a career coach. That's someone who's not your team leader. It's someone who's assigned to you to help you connect the dots across different experiences you have at Deloitte. That person existed, by the way, in our old model, kind of has to in a professional services firm. So you have someone to sort of tie together the trends across different experiences. And that's the person with whom you have that conversation. It's how do I look at this data and understand what it means for me, right? How does it align with where I want to be building my career, with where I want to be spending my time, with the questions I should be asking in my check-ins, et cetera, et cetera. And what we found was that by adding that, we were able to not only provide the transparency that people were looking for, but really hold our team leaders accountable to have honest check-ins, right? Because now you couldn't get away with saying, just keep doing what you're doing, right? Because you knew that your person was going to see their data and that you were going to have to answer that question. So this notion of accountability for honest feedback really spiked when we started showing people some of that data.
One more question before I turn it over to the rest of you all. Recently had the opportunity to help put together, and I think I was telling you this on the phone, a forum, which, by the way, we're going to be doing here going forward. You'll hear more about that later. But a forum on innovation. And the most interesting part of the conversation to me was differentiating between institutional innovation and disruptive innovation, what the differences are. But not so important to get into the definitions of those, but where the facilitator of that forum went with that question, which was, he said 2 things. You need to know your culture, and you need to know the company's appetite for change, because if you don't understand that before you try to make change, you're going to fail. So, question for you, kind of in that context. Most of the people here, if none of the people here, are coming out of a large consulting, accounting firm like Deloitte, with a unique culture, et cetera. What would be the core takeaways in your mind in terms of something of a template that the most important things they should be overlaying in the context of what they might be trying to do?
A couple things, and I, by the way, absolutely agree with that. I mean, as you think about, even just the way I've shared the tiny parts of the story today, it's very much relevant to the Deloitte culture. It's kind of unique to the Deloitte culture. I wouldn't take this model and screw it in some other company, right? I mean, it's not really that type of a thing. I think that the takeaways are, first of all, this exercise around figuring out what performance management's for. Those are really helpful organizing structure for us. By the way, we don't talk about that internally. It's not like we go out there and we're like, hey, this is all about feel, see, and recognize, right? That was an organizing structure for us, so that when we were doing the design, when we were done with the design phase, we could take a look back and say, do we have something to address each one of these objectives? So regardless of what those objectives are, really doing that, taking that time to pause to figure out why is it we're doing this, I think that was really important. I think the second thing is not starting with the end in mind. I mentioned before, a little bit of a soapbox issue for me, companies who are out there saying, I want to get rid of performance management, or I want to get rid of ratings. We made those kinds of decisions along the way because we were chasing other objectives. By the way, one of our businesses still has ratings. They do this whole process. They do weekly check-ins. They do performance snapshots, and then they use that data at the end of the year to come up with what they think are better ratings, right? So there certainly wasn't a, let's try to get rid of ratings and then figure out what a process looks like to make that work. So I think it's not starting with the what's the purpose of it as your driver, not what do I want it to look like as as your driver. I think that's really important, taking a look at your culture, knowing what the leadership appetite is. Are you the kind of place where you're only going to get one chance, so you got to get it right before you roll it out? Or would this type of testing and learning as we go kind of an approach work for you? That's a cultural decision. I think the third thing is who you get involved at the beginning. We were a group of about 6 people inside of talent development, and we built this team that included our legal people, it included people from comp, it included people from employee relations. I mean, all sorts of HR and business folks were part of the journey from the beginning. It was funny in the early days, we would go out and talk about this with our internal clients, and people would say, you should really talk to the lawyers about this, right? And it was sort of good to be able to say, don't worry, they're part of the team, and they love this, by the way. And so just sort of creating that cross-functional team so that you're anticipating in the beginning what all the downstream impacts might be. I think that's the third thing. And I would go out on a limb and say, no matter what you're doing, check-ins are a good idea, right? Bake in something to your process that encourages your people to talk to their people more frequently. There's no downside, right? And figuring out exactly what that is for you and how to frame it and how to sell it and how to train people on it and how to bake it into the organizational habits and culture, that's going to be unique by every organization. But find a way to bake into the design people talking to people more frequently, because for us it has just generated phenomenal impact, measurable impact that's really cool to be able to talk about.
Erica, awesome. I could dominate the rest of this with questions without a thought, since performance management sits at the core of everything that I think of from an HR and talent management development perspective. But please, questions.
Did you ever measure anything with regard to Kirkpatrick's level 3 behavioral change, learning transfer? Did you find that the effect of your efforts were measurable?
There's a couple of things we've been able to measure. One is now that we've got, one of the things we do with check-ins is we send out an email every other week, and we ask our people to answer one question. It says, I conducted a check-in conversation with my team leader this week. Yes, no, or there's a third choice that's like no because one of us was on vacation or something like that, right? Because you got to account for that. So we now have all of this data on check-in frequency. And what's cool about that is we can then correlate that with performance snapshot scores or with employee engagement scores. And so we've been able to measure the impact of check-in frequency. Interestingly, by the way, the jump-off is at 2 weeks. So people who have check-ins every other week are significantly higher performers than people who do them less frequently. There's actually less of a jump between people who do them biweekly and people who do them every week. We don't really talk about that internally because we want to create the habit of people doing them as frequently as possible. But it's really great to have the data to tell the story, because we've got all these stodgy partners who say, no one ever talked to me and I'm really successful. Like, why are these selfish millennials making me focus on them so much, right? Which is sort of the way some people view this is, gosh, this is a change because the millennial generation is demanding more of our attention. And we can turn around and say, no, this isn't about millennials demanding attention. This is about business results, right? That there is a tie-in between check-in frequency and performance. There's a tie-in between check-in frequency and employee engagement, and then we have all these other things, of course, that engagement are tied to. So we can really tell a data story internally about the value.
What are your thoughts about goal setting and the performance process?
Interesting question. So for us, work is constantly restarting, right? So we used to have in our old process annual goal setting, and then mid-year and year-end. And what we found was that our people would set goals and then would get staffed on some project that had absolutely nothing to do with those goals. They didn't achieve their goals, but that was okay. They weren't working on that stuff, right? So what we found was, for us, annual goal setting from the standpoint of performance goals was not useful. What we want folks to do is, when you start on a new engagement, have a first check-in, and we actually provide guidance of a first check-in should look different than the subsequent check-ins, right? A first check-in should look like this, and some of the questions that you should include are, what are some of the goals on this project, right? And how do I use my strengths? How do I help you as my team leader understand what my strengths are, and how am I going to bring my strengths to the delivery of those goals? And then let's use subsequent check-ins to check in on those goals. But that the goals should live at the work level as opposed to at the annual level, which is sort of this arbitrary thing, right? However, we do want people setting career goals, right? We want to make sure that in addition to the local goals inside the work, people have the opportunity to say, I want to take my career in this direction versus that, and therefore I need to make sure I'm getting the right kinds of opportunities. So we encourage people to set career goals with their coach, but those, again, are not necessarily linked to the annual timeline. It may be, what do I want to do in the next 6 months, where I want to be 3 years from now. That's kind of up to you and your coach to figure out what the right time horizon is for those career goals and how frequently you want to revisit them.
Ross?
To pick up on that idea of career goals and development, that very often ties into succession planning, because you want people to be lined up for the next job and actually have it to be something that they want to do. So how do you fold that information that happens with that career coach into that process that ties then? Is it totally separate from performance management, or is it tied? Is there overlap?
I'm glad you asked that question. I'm glad you asked it in that way. We've lost the ability to talk about what is performance management, what isn't, because it's kind of blurring into everything, right? There's employee engagement, there's development, there's performance management, there's succession planning, there's talent. It's all kind of blurry now, which is fine for us internally. It makes it hard to talk about externally, though, because people have this notion of like departments, right? There's the reason I'm happy you asked the question is because there's a component of the design I didn't speak about, which is what we call talent reviews. So we encourage our leaders to do talent reviews quarterly. The idea is that each quarter, you and your HR business partner, your generalist, should sit down and think about what segment do we want to focus on this quarter. For the most part, everyone uses one of your 4 talent reviews to focus on promotion, right? Let's talk about the people who are kind of eligible or up for promotion. But then you've got 3 others. What segment do you want to focus on? And depending on what's going on in the market, you might use those talent reviews to review different segments of people. Sometimes people will use them to say, I'm going to focus this quarter on everyone who is an experienced hire who's been here fewer than 6 months, to make sure those folks are getting traction. Or we're going to focus on someone with this particular hot skill that's new in the market, or whatever it may be. And the idea is that that's not a performance review where I'm ranking you relative to one another, but it's, what do we need to do for John, right? Based on the data that we have on John, based on what John's coach is telling us he wants to do next and where he wants to take his career, based on the opportunities we know we have with our clients right now, what are the development opportunities we need to be connecting John with? And in some cases, that's go take a course, right? And in some cases, it's let's connect John to this network of people or to these mentors. And in some cases, it's, let's get him the right kinds of assignments or provide him new opportunities. But the idea is that there's a developmental focus there. And then unlike the experience where you talked about where, it's kind of, it's a tomb, right? The idea is your coach comes out of that meeting and says, hey, it was your turn this quarter, and here's what we talked about, and here's what our action steps are. So a lot of the succession planning kinds of conversations happen in that forum.
And so how does that information track as you sort of do talent planning for the corporation, and then or workforce planning, because you need to understand where your skill sets and competencies play out against what you want to do in the future?
Yeah, so interestingly, again, we're not a corporation, so this notion of like promotion to the next level is a little bit different. It's a little bit more fluid, right? We're sort of a collection of people with skills, and then there are opportunities, and you staff them there, and then over time, when you're ready for the next level, you get promoted. It's not quite like corporate succession planning. So certainly an organization that's more corporately structured would have to do this differently. But for us, the HR business partner's role has really changed in this. HR used to be the folks who kind of kept track of how many 2s and 3s we had. And then if you forgot, we could tell you, right? Now, HR, it's really on HR to facilitate a different kind of dialogue, take different notes. And what we've seen, and this was sort of an unintended consequence. I wouldn't say unintended, because of course everyone's always playing for this, but we didn't necessarily think it would be as big an impact as it was, is that HR is really playing a much more strategic role than ever before, because HR is in the center of those conversations, keeping track of that, and then sitting down quarterly with the business leaders to say, here's what our data looks like right now. Here's what our scatter plot looks like. Here are the people who've been flagged at risk for low performance. Remember, at our last talent review, we talked about these people. Let's check in on them and see how they're doing. So there's this ongoing dialogue 4 times a year at minimum where HR is bringing this data to the business to think about how to act on that. So some of the succession planning happens in there.
On fascinated. I've implemented performance management systems in about 4 different organizations in which I've worked, and I've tried a lot of what you talked about. The hook, though, I'm still trying to figure out what was the hook to get those managers galvanized to want to participate, because they keep talking to their people, which, I mean, is so basic and simple.
Couple things. So one was we started with this premise of this isn't new. Our best managers are doing this already, right? And by the way, that's a really great way to motivate people. Say, oh, our best leaders are doing this already. Well, I'm one of our best leaders, so I better be doing this, right? So there's a little bit of that. I think there's also the, kind of putting it out there that it was an expectation that you're having regular conversations and putting the onus on the team member to schedule them. Right, so if I'm a team leader and my people are coming to me and say, "Hey, when's it time for our check-in?" It's going to be awkward for me to say, "Oh no, we're not doing that on this team." Right, especially if my people are getting an email every week that says I did it or I didn't do it. And then the other thing is, if I'm going to bother having those conversations, I don't want them to be uncomfortable, right? I want them to be good. So I'm going to be innately motivated to say, gosh, I've got to spend this half hour talking to my people. I'd rather it go well than not well. And so I'm motivated to get it done. But I think the biggest hook for us was saying it's a conversation about the work. If we had said it's a conversation about your career, it's a conversation about development, I don't think people would have done it. Not because our people are selfish, but because our people are busy. But by saying it's a conversation about the work, we've really changed this notion. And this, again, this wasn't necessarily intended, but it's kind of my favorite thing about this design, that we've changed this notion that performance management is that thing that you stop work to go do. Right? You're not stopping work and going and doing performance management. You're just kind of performing all the time and managing it, right, by talking about the work. And so it's really blurred. Well, what is work and what is managing and what is this HR process thing called performance management? The boundaries have been blurred, and I think that's what's helped our people to get over the hump of this is how I get my work done. Right? This is how I check in on my team. This is how I manage responsibly. This is how I know that I can report up to my leader and my check-in about what's going on the team is by talking to my people. And our data's not perfect, right? There are still people who resist it. But on average, we're doing pretty well.
I actually sat in on a webinar not long ago where the new word coupling focused on what we're trying to accomplish here in order to attract the business line into what HR is trying to talk about and getting it off the HR agenda, becoming a business agenda, is performance development. How do you drive performance in the business as opposed to manage performance? Semantics in one sense, but different.
I have 2 questions. One, you talk a little bit more about the career coach model and how they're selected and trained. And my other question is the compensation question.
I was waiting. It's usually the first question. This group is so patient. So sure, the career coach. Again, this is a concept that I think might be unique to professional services, right? But we need someone that's going to help you connect dots across individual activities, across individual experiences. Everyone at Deloitte who's a manager or above is a coach. Some of them are good at it. Some of them are not good at it, right? My dream is that someday coaching is a strengths role, that if you're strengthened by coaching, you're going to be a coach, and you're going to have many, many coachees, and if you're not, you're not. Unfortunately, our leverage models are just such that we can't make it work, right? We can't, someone can't have 19 coachees, right? Just no one has time to do that and do it well. And so we have an expectation that Deloitte is a team-based business. Part of leading, part of being successful at Deloitte is leading people. Part of leading people is what you do on your teams, and part of leading people is coaching. And so we expect that everyone of a certain level is a coach. You are a coach to someone who's at least one level junior to you, but sometimes not more than that. So it gets kind of awkward when one gets promoted and then you have to switch coaches. And in terms of training, that's, I think, one of the biggest things that we're focused on right now. We took a similar approach as we did with our team leaders. So year 1 was about training them on what to do, right? My old job as a coach was helping you fill out your year-end forms and then representing you at that consensus meeting. Now that's gone, so what am I supposed to do as a coach, right? So we spent year 1 training people on, here's what it is to have a strengths discovery conversation. Here's how you would help someone sit down with their performance dashboard and kind of the what to do. And now we're starting to build tools. We've got a micro-learning module. We've got some guides and placemats and all sorts of self-study kinds of content on what coaching looks like, right? And how coaching isn't about giving the answer, but facilitating someone's own discovery and all of that. I think we have variability in the quality of our people, and I think we always will. I think some people are just natural coaches, and for other people, it's a little bit more of a stretch. And you change your coach every couple of years so that you're getting multiple perspectives from multiple people. So it's something that's just kind of part of the professional services world. So it wasn't a new addition for this model. What we've done is we've kept the old vestige of the old model, and then we've changed it a little bit to be fit for purpose for this new approach. She wants the comp question before we move on, right? Comp, okay. Who wants to hear about comp? Okay. It's my least favorite part of talking about this, but I know. So interestingly, this design is all about more conversations and more data, right? And my perspective is we have more data than we ever did before to help you pay your people, right? It used to be, you know one thing about me. You know that I'm a 2. That's all you know, right? So you're going to pay me exactly the same as you pay every other 2. But if you think about the way people become 1s and 2s and 3s and 4s and 5s, there's let me say it this way, there's probably very little difference in performance between our lowest 2 and our highest 3, right? Kind of luck of the draw, right, in terms of, which one goes above the line and which one goes below the line. But if you think about the way we compensate those people, there's a huge difference in how we compensate those people. So what we wanted to start to do is have the comp be more aligned with the differences in performance. John and I were talking before the session about, there's all this talk about is pay for performance really a good thing. We at Deloitte do believe that it is. We are proud of our pay for performance culture, did not want to do away with that in any way by moving towards this performance process. And our old approach to rating you was more or less a process by which we took a look at what we know about you, and we applied some leadership judgment to come up with an outcome that gets plugged into comp. So that's really what we do today still. We take what we know about you and we apply some judgment to figure out what to pay you. Now there are a couple different things we know about you, right? We know where you fall relative to your peers on that scatter plot. We know how you performed relative to your metrics, right? The expectations of you from a measurement perspective. And we know a little bit about the other things that you did inside of the practice, kind of extracurricularly, to grow the firm. So the idea is that every leader gets that data. At the end of the year, they get their budget. There's all the work that's always done around comp in terms of where you are in your range and all of that, right? But the piece of it that's related to performance is based on those 3 data points. We encourage our comp planners, the folks who are making the decisions or who are doing the work to impact the decision, to use their judgment, right? I may sell $2 million of work because I've pounded the pavement and I've identified the lead and I've closed the sale. John may sell $2 million of work because he's working closely with a guy who did that and he got schlepped along and got lucky, right? So we know that the data doesn't tell the full story. And so we even inside of Deloitte have lots of smart people in math. They came to us and they said, great news, HR. We did you guys a favor and we built you an algorithm, right? We've built you the perfect formula for this new design. And it takes, 2 parts, performance snapshot score minus a this, and then you add on firm contributions and you divide by the number of sales hours and here's your comp answer, right? And we said, thank you so much, and we're not interested, right? Because we really want people to be paying people, right? Not machines or formulas to be paying people, because when I sit across from you at the end of the year and I deliver to you your comp, your increase, and your bonus, I need to be able to tell the story, right? I need to be able to take a look at that performance dashboard, say, here's all the stuff we have on paper, here's all the other stuff I know about the context behind that data, here's how I use that to make a decision. And so as much as we go out there and talk about how now we have more data than ever before to help us make smart decisions, we still want human beings applying their judgment. We think that's a good thing, that leaders are applying judgment. We want our leaders to apply judgment. We need to help give them parameters within which to do that, but we still have people paying people. So we just completed the first year of the whole firm going through this process through to comp season. So our fiscal year is June 1st to June 1st, but comp gets paid out September 2nd. So we've just kind of gotten over the hump of comp conversations. And we did do some training this year for the comp communicators to say, hey, you got to tell a different story than you used to, right? It used to be, great news, here's your increase. Why? Because you're a 2, conversation over. Right? I leave somewhat dissatisfied with the conversation, but at least I kind of knew what to expect. Right now, it's a much more robust conversation. Now it's harder, by the way. Our managers say comp is harder. I actually need to think. I have a client that I spoke with, a former client of mine who leads talent in a pharmaceutical company, and she has this great quote that I find myself quoting all the time. What she says about her organization is, in my organization, you could do comp drunk. And I think that is just such a funny thing to say, right? I mean, her point is basically like the math just tells the story, right? And she said, I want to get to a point where you can no longer do comp drunk. I am pleased to say that at Deloitte, you definitely cannot do comp drunk, right? It really requires judgment, and that's harder for our leaders, but we think it's where good decisions come from.
Erica, when you started tonight, you talked about 1.8 million hours in performance management. I'm curious, now that you've been through the whole firm in the U.S. for 1 year, what do those numbers look like?
We don't track it. So we tracked it for that purpose of kind of telling that story to leadership. Had leadership come to us and said, figure out a way to do it in less time, I guess we'd have to keep tracking it. My hunch is it's probably a little bit more. I think that originally when we weren't going to have the transparency component of it, right, when we weren't going to have that whole dot showing conversation, the thinking was, all right, you used to spend lots of time filling out forms and talking about your people. Now go reinvest that time almost 100% in check-ins. And that's what the bulk of it is, right? We've taken that same time that you spent filling out forms and sitting in the meetings for 2 days, and we've reinvested it in check-ins. However, we still have that conversation where you sit down and go through the performance dashboard. So that's taking a little bit off that total. So we don't track it anymore because it's not about hours for us, which feels a little bit like an act of defiance a little bit to say that it's not about the hours, right? It's about the output. But my hunch would be it's probably a little bit more, and that's not bad.
But you have shifted the quality of the result.
Yeah.
Maybe the same time or a little bit more, but the end result has a much higher value.
Well, and it's a value, this maybe sounds a little salesy, but it's a value that that benefit our clients, right? So if you think about kind of this old process was for the firm, right? It was something we stopped serving clients to take a break to do, to enable us to generate outcomes at a firm level. To generate talent decisions. Now, I'm talking to my people every week. That person is going to be better at serving his or her client that week or the next week or the following month as a result of those conversations. So it stops to be an investment in an HR process, and it's an investment of how we do our work. So I think it would be hard now to count what are the hours that we're spending on performance management because the lines have been blurred between what is performance management and what is work. It's just kind of driving performance, which is what work is.
Probably have time for one more.
I'm wondering, you said something earlier in your conversation about this not potentially working in other firms, which I thought was kind of struck me. And I'm wondering if you think that because the nature of your business is to have highly educated folks who have similar types of conversations with their clients all the time, but that potentially has advantaged you in being able to do things like roll this out without guidance and sort of allow them to have their comp discussion. Those are some big risks, I think, especially in a bigger organization. And I'm wondering if culture you thought you'd get to do that and execute that because of the type of people that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely a great point. When I say I don't know that it would work in other organizations, I don't know that it wouldn't. I'm just saying I don't know that it would, right? So there are lots of organizations out there who are moving towards check-ins, who are moving towards more frequent conversations, who have, shop room floors and labor unions and, all sorts of different types of workforces. I personally haven't done the research or been involved in those organizations to know whether or not this would work there or whether a version of it would work there. What I do know is that one of the first groups we piloted with was our administrative assistants, and we did that on purpose because they were kind of the most different from everybody else at Deloitte, and so we wanted to see how it would work there. Admittedly, this process works a tiny bit different in our corporate functions than it does in our client service functions, right, where the corporate, HR, IT, et cetera, where the work is a little bit more repeatable. I don't know how this would work in other organizations. I just know how it worked at Deloitte. But I do know that lots of organizations in lots of different industries, I read some study recently that said 52 organizations are known to have moved in this direction. I would think, based on the demand for this kind of dialogue, the number's probably higher. And that doesn't mean necessarily that all 52 of those don't have ratings at the end, but more just that, an organization to move towards a culture of more conversations and more data. I think that's something that could probably fly in any industry. Exactly how it gets implemented would differ company to company.
It's actually a good question to explore, because I know, and when I heard Erica speak on a panel, one of the companies that was on the panel have large manufacturing environments, and they hadn't rolled it out there yet, and weren't sure how it would work there, and they hadn't cracked the code of how to make it work there. So they've avoided it thus far and piloting it elsewhere.
Yeah.
So
I know at the Gap.
I disagree that it could work. I think that doing it without giving people a lot of training and development and guidance on it is probably a big risk that I think, my speculation, this work well because of the caliber of folks that we have in the firm. It doesn't mean it wouldn't work somewhere else, but I would imagine there have to be more training and guidance and development in some of those.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
we can do one more if somebody has one.
With all this conversation, I wonder if there were secondary benefits that have come out, because normally when an employee speaks with a manager, they often talk about there's this problem, this system's getting in the way, this procedure's getting in the way, this team's not productive. Have you seen secondary things where systems are getting improved, procedures are getting improved, employee morale's going up, retention's going up? Have you seen secondary things besides just the employee feedback on
Yes.
performance?
Yes. So again, it's. I don't know that I would differentiate between that and what the goals were, right? But this whole notion of risk identification, this whole notion of uncovering something before it gets too far gone. There's a big push around well-being inside of Deloitte, right? We work our people really hard and then they quit because they're tired. And so this notion of, well, if I'm sitting down with you anyway once a week, it's a really good opportunity to check in on how you doing, right? Are you burnt out? Do we need to do something different from a work schedule standpoint? Not in like an official kind of way, but like, how can I help you better meet some of your personal goals? So there's all these increases in areas that, if you think about that HR survey that we have, the talent survey that we have, they don't fall in the performance management category, but I would like to think that check-ins are part of what's driving some of the impacts there, because people are just more connected to their people, right? I know you better, and therefore I can identify risks for clients, I can identify risks for my people. The part of the design that I didn't talk about was this team pulse survey, where we have 10 questions that we ask teams around drivers of performance, and then that data, team leaders can say, hey, here's our data, let's talk about it as a team and figure out which one of these do we want to try and increase our scores on, and what do we as a team need to do differently in order to make that happen. So there's lots of talk around, gosh, because I have check-ins, because I have these pulse survey conversations with my team, I as a leader am able to uncover things sooner. I, as a leader, feel like I have the excuse to have the conversations I know I should have been having all along, but just kind of always felt awkward to bring it up. And I, as a team member, feel like I have the forum, just the regular forum, to bring these things up because it's now accepted inside of the culture. So how much of that we're not necessarily measuring all of that, but anecdotally, absolutely. And then we've been able to identify, of those 10 questions in the pulse survey, which of them are predictors of turnover, and can start to intervene with leaders to say, hey, John, your team recently took a pulse survey, and teams that score low on these 2 questions tend to have people leave, and here are 3 questions to ask in your next pulse debrief. Or you've got a team member whose performance snapshot scores are dipping, here are 3 questions to ask in your next check-in. So we can really use the data to be, based on what we know from a predictive standpoint around the trends that come from the data, to really intervene with individual leaders to help them know when there's a problem, right? It's like when you get that thing on your computer that says you have 10% battery left, you may want to plug in. I always think it's so polite that it says you may want to plug in, right? That's kind of the way we now are enabling our leaders to be better leaders. And that's what's, I think, enabled us to get away with less classroom time, right? I don't need to run you through a full day training on how to be a great leader. We do a lot of that, by the way, but I don't need to run you through a full day training on all the things you need to know prospectively about being a leader. If I've got real-time data, I can deliver to you to say, hey, here's something we've seen in the data from your team. Go fix it in this way. So yes, absolutely, to your question.
Well, Erica, there is no way I can thank you enough for coming all the way from New Jersey up here to Connecticut.
Thank you for having me.
I hope everybody really took something away from this that they can take to their clients, their companies, whatever. Performance management, from my point of view, is core to whatever function you have in HR. Performance management is the driver. Performance development is the driver. It sits at the middle of everything else managers should be doing. So, again, Erica, thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone.